Welcome to the session ArcGIS Dashboards, Tips and Tricks. My name is Sandra Lucan, and I'm a product engineer with the ArcGIS Dashboards team. Over the next half hour or so, we're going to cover a lot of content as it relates to configuring your dashboards. We'll look first at layout and design considerations, some hidden or often overlooked settings with charts, indicators, and lists. We'll also look at adding interactivity into your dashboard where appropriate, and also finally wrapping up with performance considerations and a few different strategies for configuring your dashboards for potentially higher usage scenarios. All of this content will be covered through a series of demonstrations. However, a slide presentation covering the high-level concepts that we will talk about should be available for your reference as well. So first, before we start looking at a dashboard, we need to consider the layout and design options that are available to us. And with this, we need to understand the purpose of our dashboard. We need to understand the audience for this. What is their familiarity with the subject and the terminology that you're planning on using? Is this designed for management to make quick decisions while viewing the dashboard on their mobile phone? Is this going to be dashboard be available to everybody in your organization? Or is it a dashboard designed for the public to share information and get frequent updates on an ongoing event? What is the frequency of use of your dashboard? Will this be monitored daily? Is this going to be displayed on a wall-mounted screen in an operations center? Or is it something that could be referenced maybe once a month or every quarter with new statistics and information that has become available? And also, what is the viewing method? We mentioned mobile phones, we mentioned wall-mounted displays. Will your users be allowed to or invited to interact with the dashboard and be able to click content to drill down and get a little bit more information and more details? Or is this a passive display, again, on a wall-mounted screen? Or will this even be embedded in another site and be used in context of some other information that is being presented? So keep all of this in mind as we're going through this presentation and showing you some layout and design tricks to maximize all of this. So we're going to use this dashboard to look at a number of layout tips and a few design ideas, keeping in mind everything that we just discussed about knowing your audience, mechanism of use, frequency of use, and so on. And one of the top tips that we have for everyone is the ability to reduce the amount that is displayed when the dashboard first opens. And this will be a bit of a recurring theme throughout this presentation. But first off, we'll show you a tip here on how to stack elements and put some of that content that maybe doesn't need to be seen right when the dashboard first opens into a different location. So it's still accessible and there for reference, but it doesn't clutter the display and overwhelm your users when it first launches. Because there's a lot of information going on with this dashboard right now, and it's all really good, but perhaps takes away from the purpose and the key message that we're trying to get across about which sampling sites have an advisory and maybe what are some of the details about that advisory and why it is that way. So the tip here is to be able to stack our elements and create a tabbed user experience. So what we can do is pick up each element, drag it into a new location. We can see the tip here to stack the items. We drop it in that new location, and now we have a tabbed user experience. And you can see I can edit this title to provide a really good context of what should be found in that tab. And I can repeat this. I can have many different tabs, keep stacking them one after the other. And if the map is still sort of the main piece of information that you want to display when the dashboard first opens, you can take this entire stack and dock it behind the map as well. So you've got a really nice tabbed layout here. So this is a great way to have lots of information in your dashboard, but be available as your user interacts with it instead of being presented with all this information at once and overwhelming. The other thing to consider as well is the overall design of the dashboard in terms of color context. Perhaps you want to align your colors with your corporate branding or your organization, or pull out colors that are used in the map element. Or if you're embedding in another site, you want to leverage those theme colors as well. And the dashboards offer a number of different color options for you to control at both the dashboard level or be able to overwrite at the individual element level as well. And we support lots of different ways of inputting those colors. You can use the color picker here, but also hex values, RGB, and HSL as well. So if you have a color that you're using somewhere else and want to make sure you're using the same color here in the dashboard, lots of different formats that are supported to input that value. We'll continue on using this dashboard as we dive into looking at individual elements. And the first one that we're going to look at is the serial chart. And lots of different options here with serial charts that we want to dig into and look at some of the maybe less commonly used settings. So we'll open up this first serial chart here, and it's a very simple one using a lot of the defaults, except that they've gone ahead and changed the color away from that default orange color. Very nice to see, nice blue color, fits with the theme of representing different water body types. And given our data, using the defaults in this case is not too bad actually. We've actually categorized or binned our data and grouped it by water body type. So that's along the category or x-axis. We have a simple count to show how many of these water bodies were sampled, and we have that labeled on the y-axis. So overall, not bad, very simple, using a lot of the default values. If we look at the next serial chart, however, we see that very similar approach was taken. A lot of the default values, again, except for the color. We're missing a few labels, and maybe that's okay based on the content and information that's provided here. But we'll notice here that this chart is actually showing our categories or bins by date. And as soon as we have date-based information, we should actually be thinking about a different type of chart that can be configured in our dashboard. So let's go ahead and look at the configuration settings here. We're going to switch over to the Series tab, and we're going to look at the different type options. By default, we choose a column chart, and we should consider a line or even a smooth line in this case because we have continuous data here, because we are mapping dates. And we've got a date range here of 14 days in early August, and that's great. Once you do choose a line or a smooth line option, there actually is one other setting that allows us to create an area chart. And that's simply by changing the fill opacity to something other than 0 and filling in all of that area below the line. And suddenly we have a very different looking chart, a little bit easier perhaps to see the fluctuations in our data over time. So consider for date-based charts, for clarity and for performance, use the line and perhaps even use a fill opacity. If your dashboard is inviting users to interact with it, you will notice some options that you can configure for a hover action. As a user hovers their mouse over these data points, we see the information about the category and the value appear. Now, these data points may actually stick out and be kind of cluttering the display and perhaps providing a little bit too much information, and we can actually turn the visibility of them off. Or what we can actually do is change the opacity to 0 and maintain that hover capability. So a little tip there for us. One of the things, if we do have a hover capability, we could have a look at whether or not we need all of these vertical and horizontal axis decorations. Do we need the labels? Do we need the values themselves? And if we look at the value axis first, I do want to point out these two settings here for the minimum and maximum value, and notice how these are set to automatic. So this is calculated based on the values in your data. And in this case, there's sort of minor fluctuations in our water temperature over this time period. So by setting our min and max values to be automatic, this has been calculated to better show these minor fluctuations. If we actually set the minimum value to 0, in this case, those minor fluctuations are not perhaps noticed as much, but it does give a better context to the data and understanding the bigger picture of those values themselves. So do pay attention to your chart and whether it makes sense to choose a minimum and maximum value or whether to have this set automatically. While we're here on this axis too, we can go ahead and look at the visibility and settings for the labels and axis themselves, and whether or not this information needs to be displayed or whether this information can be gathered from other locations in the chart, such as the title, description, or even in the dashboard itself. So we can actually turn off the visibility of our labels. We can change the opacity of our axis and grids. And both on the value and category axis, we can make these same changes. And suddenly our chart becomes much cleaner and gives a general overall picture to the information contained within it. Not necessarily suitable to all charts, but consider these options to reduce the clutter and overall look and display of your dashboard. This is especially a good tip for those that are having charts on mobile devices if you're looking for a quick glance or change over time. We're going to continue digging into a few more elements with the same dashboard, and we're going to move over to the pie chart and talk about some tips here on how to make this a little bit more readable and a little bit more simplistic to understand what is actually going on here. And remember, the purpose of a pie chart is to display percentages of the total or the part to whole relationships. If that's not the type of information that you want to convey to your end users, you may want to look at a serial chart or even a gauge instead of using the pie chart. And a couple of things that we're going to look at here with this example are the small slices here that are all very tiny and hard to distinguish, but then also overall the ease of interpreting the size or percentage difference between the remaining slices. So let's dive into the configuration for the pie chart. And we're going to go over to the Slices tab and first address these small little pieces here. We're going to look for the setting called Grouping Percentage. And we're going to modify that to actually take all of those slices, all of those ones in this case that are 5% or less, and group them together into a category. Now, I can go ahead and change the color of this to make them either stand out or maybe in my case, maybe fade a little bit into the background and not stand out as much. So already our pie chart has been cleaned up just by grouping these slices together. And then let's deal with these other slices that are all sort of similar in value, but there are some differences, and it's very hard for us to distinguish those differences when they're shown in a pie chart like this because it's hard for us to compare area. So we're going to go over to the Chart tab this time, and we're going to look for a setting called Inner Radius. And we're going to modify that to turn this chart from a pie chart into a donut chart. And what this does is it turns the area comparison with those slices into a linear comparison with each one of those categories. And it'll make it a little bit easier for us in the eye to understand what's happening here. And we may want to also consider a few other settings on this same chart tab. We have the ability to turn on or off our hover text, which is only helpful if we're inviting users to interact with our dashboard. And instead of labels, we may want to hide these labels and use a legend instead. A little bit clearer, less clutter in the overall display. So just by making those 3 or 4 changes, we've suddenly produced a much cleaner, simple, easy to distinguish and interpret pie chart instead. So we're going to switch gears here so we can look at the indicator element. And on first glance, you're going to see a couple of things that are different with this dashboard compared to the ones that we were previously looking at. First of all, we see that there's no map element contained within this dashboard, and that's okay. You don't need the map element. Your elements data sources can come from your feature layers or table layers directly, no map required. The other thing that you'll see is a very simplistic dashboard, and this was done on purpose because this was actually designed for mobile use. And using our browser tools, there's actually ways to emulate and see what this would actually look like on a mobile device. So a really great tip for those of us that are designing with mobile in use, and you can get a preview here so you can go ahead and maybe tweak font sizes, whether or not you show icons, even the color, and so on. So digging into this dashboard a little bit more and the indicators themselves, we know that indicators support a number of different statistic types, including sums, averages, standard deviations, and percentiles. We know that also that we can include icons and of course control the font size and number formatting as well. But let's dig in a little bit deeper with this indicator because here I'm using a reference value. And reference values can come from a fixed number, but also from a statistic from this data source or even a separate data source. And it could also leverage a previous value as well. Once we have a reference value configured, then we can go over to our indicator tab as well and take advantage of that using a number of predefined calculations. So in this case, I want to try and give some context to this number about how many people have received the first dose and give an idea of the percentage of the population that has received it. So instead of using the reference value for my bottom text, I'm going to update that to use percentage instead. You see that update here in the preview. And we can also take advantage of a number of the formatting options below just by going in here and maybe altering or adding some decimal places to this number to give a higher sense of accuracy. Once we have a reference value set, we also have enabled the conditional formatting option. And what this allows you to do is actually change the formatting based on two different conditions, whether or not this is the value at or above the reference, or whether it's styled below the reference value. And you can see that all my configuration options have essentially been duplicated, so I can choose the different fields, even the colors or font size, and even text under these two different conditions. And that's really nice options to have. If we want to take this a step further, we now have an advanced formatting option using arcade expressions. And I'm going to go over and use the last indicator just to give you a brief preview of what this can do. You'll notice first is that I don't have an actual reference value set, and that's okay, it's not required. I can go into the indicator, enable the advanced formatting, and we can see that one of the first things that's available is the ability to set a reference value right in here. Now, I've just used the standard fixed value, but again, you could use this from a number of different ways or calculations. Now, what this author has decided to do is actually create many different conditions or scenarios in which I want to control the formatting for this element. So not do I just have two scenarios, but in this case I have four. So based on different percentages of the population that have been vaccinated, I want to update the formatting of the indicator, maybe by the color, the text, the font size, maybe even an icon. And all of that is possible using Arcade. And I really encourage you, if you're really interested in leveraging Arcade, to go check out the Arcade documentation as a start, and then have a look at the series of blog articles and examples that we have, as well as a number of sessions at the conference about using Arcade within dashboards. And I'll provide links to those references at the end of this presentation. Following on from our discussion with the indicator element, we're going to dive into lists using some similar data. And in this case, this dashboard is very simple, again, showing a series of testing centers, their location on the map, and some detailed information. And we'll see actually with this list element that Arcade has also been used. We've got advanced formatting options available here as well, just like we did with the indicator, to extract that information and display it in perhaps a more easy to understand and digest manner. Now, just because we can use Arcade here to style and bring out that information is not necessarily licensed to bring it all out. Your list element is still a very useful element, but perhaps there are other approaches if there's a lot of information packed into your data source. And that's where the details element can come in handy, because it is a way to present all that information that's formatted in your pop-up that you spent all the time configuring in your map element, and display it here on the dashboard without sort of any extra coding or additional coding required. The other thing to consider here is whether or not all this information is needed when the dashboard first loads. Does it make sense to show all of this detailed information, all series of the testing centers right away? Or does it only make sense to show this when we actually filter an element? So there is a filter action here. As I select a testing center, we'll see that details information update. I want to take this a step further and use a new setting that we have available under Actions called Render Only When Filtered. And notice that it's pointing to our details element. As I make a selection in the list, we're now actually going to control the visibility of that element, such that now a selection is required in order to see the details. We're presented with a custom message to provide information to our users that they must first make a selection in order to see the details. And this way they can control the visibility of that extra information on their dashboard when it first loads to at times when it makes sense. Instead of being overwhelmed with all the details initially, we want to make that available only when the user has interacted and made a selection in their dashboard. So look for that new setting. Fortunately, not available with Dashboards Classic, but that is available with ArcGIS Dashboards now. We're going to move on to talking about performance considerations, specifically with dashboards that are shared to the public, as you want to ensure that your configuration choices are going to scale well with increased, concurrent, and of course, heavy usage. Note that this will apply to Dashboards Classic as well. First, it's really important to follow the best practices for your data, layers, and maps. And this information is shared through a few sessions at the conference, as well as a number of reference documents online. But in the dashboard itself, there are a few changes to make in preparation for high scalability. So we'll look at the topic of relative date filters to start. So when we're talking about relative date filters, let's just go into an element here and look at the filter that we can apply and choose a date column. What we're talking about are the ones that are relative to now, where now is an ever-changing value. So these ones get a little bit more difficult to cache and repeat because now is a moving concept. So queries such as is within the last or within the next, and is also the queries of is before using a period of now. So we want to be cautious in using these when we are planning to share this dashboard to the public, and especially to ensure high scalability. You may want to consider pre-processing your data. So these calculations are done in advance and therefore making the dashboard a bit more performant. We're going to use this dashboard here to talk a little bit about performance, especially when it comes to configuring actions between the map and other dependent elements. In this case, what happens here is as I pan or zoom a map extent, all of my different indicators are being updated to reflect all the features that are found within the extent. And this is done through the map actions that are configured here. So when the map extent changes, we're going to filter all of my different indicators. Now, if we think about what's happening behind the scenes, as I pan or zoom the map, I'm getting a new unique map extent. That is being sent off to the server. We're then calculating all the features that fall within the map extent and are being returned to my client. Now, that is a unique extent. It's not repeatable by anyone else, and therefore it's not cacheable. So if we scale this dashboard up, and there's a lot of use of this particular feature and this dashboard all at the same time, I'm sending a lot of non-repeatable queries to my server, and that can be a performance concern. So let's look at this dashboard instead. Very similar configuration with one change to ensure that we're using repeatable and cacheable queries. So in this case, I don't have any map extent filter actions configured here. You don't see anything listed here, but instead I've replaced that with, in this case, a category selector based on ward number. And this is going to drive the map not only changing the extent, but also updating of all our indicator elements that are dependent on it. So as I make a change here, we are going to see the map pan and or zoom, and then our indicators will update accordingly. And this is being driven by a series of filter actions again. This one happens to be based on fields. My data that I'm using is a different data source, which is fine. And there is a primary and foreign key relationship, so I do that field mapping. And this is what drives the very similar action we saw in the previous dashboard, being able to update the indicators based on the location of the map. So consider this approach instead for any dashboards that you're concerned about performance, high usage, to ensure that you're using repeatable and cacheable queries. So those are two of the top tips that you want to consider whenever sharing your dashboard publicly and planning for high scalability. The other one that is mentioned on the slide here is about sharing your dashboards using the generic URL, which starts with www.arcgis.com, rather than including your org name in that link. Do follow this link here to find out more information about building highly scalable dashboards, and don't forget the other sessions on preparing your data and maps as well. So we've covered a lot of information in this session, and we do hope that you'll check out a number of these tips and apply them to your dashboards as well. And I've included here a number of resources for you, including our documentation, a series of our best practices, and as well as a number of blog articles, and of course, our active GeoNet community. So I encourage you to check out the other dashboard sessions at this conference that dig deeper into using Arcade as well. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing all the dashboards that you create.